Hi, everybody. We are going to do simplifying trig expressions today. Um, we already talked about verifying trig expressions. Simplifying is almost the exact same thing. We're using the same kind of tips to do it. But the main difference is when we were verifying, we had an equal sign. So we were trying to get the one side of the equal sign to look like the other side. In this case, we don't have an equal sign. We're just trying to make whatever they give us as simple as possible. So sometimes this is easier, sometimes it's harder. Maybe what's harder about this is we're not sure when we're done. And when we had an equal sign, we kind of knew what our goal was. Here, we just have to kind of look at it and it's like, nah, I don't think I can make this any more compact. So we're just going to remind ourselves of what some of the rules are here. So these are tips for simplifying, and they're pretty much the same thing as verifying. There's just no equal sign. So some of the recommendations: turn everything to sine and cosine. Look for ways to bring terms together by finding a common denominator. So if you have a plus or a minus in between terms, you want to try to bring those together as one term because we're trying to make it as compact and simple as possible. Remember those trig identities: sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, etc. Get rid of fractions within fractions. Look for common factors. Look for opportunities to multiply by 1, multiply by the conjugate. Okay? This is just a reminder of what the trig identities are. So sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, 1 plus cotangent squared equals cosecant squared, and tangent squared plus 1 equals secant squared. All right, so here were some of the tips. Reminder of the Pythagorean identities. We're going to try some. Okay, so same ideas. So I'm going to look at this one on the left, and I'm going to start by changing everything to sine and cosine. Well, this first one is already cosine, so this is cosine, but then cosecant is 1 over sine, and tan is sine over cos. So I'm just going to see what happens there. I'm going to put this over 1, and I'm going to cross off anything that I can. So I see cos over cos crosses off, sine over sine crosses off, and what do you know? I'm left with 1 over 1, which is 1. I don't think we can get much simpler than that. All right, so again, we didn't have an equal sign that told us the goal was 1, but I pretty quickly found it's like I ended up with just one term. I'm not going to be able to get it any simpler than that. Okay, looking at the one on the right, again, I think I'm going to start by changing everything to sine and cosine, which is this cotangent. And I see it's cotangent squared, so I'm probably going to end up writing it out twice anyway, so I may as well do that now. Maybe I'll do it in a different color just so we see what we're changing. So cotangent is cos over sin. And we'll write that out twice. Cos over sin. See what we end up with. I'm just going to remind myself this is over 1, but that is a separate term, right? That's a separate term. So when I'm crossing off top to bottom, you guys, I can only cross off top to bottom within that. So it looks like a sine over sine crosses off, and that's about it. So I'm left with sine, I'm just going to keep it over 1, plus cos times cos is cosine squared over sine. Okay, so that doesn't look very simple. So I want to, again, bring it together more. It should look more compact. I notice I have 2 terms, so I'm going to try to add those 2 fractions. And what do we need to do when we add 2 fractions? We need to find a common denominator. So my common denominator would be sine. So if I multiply the top and bottom of that first one by sine, then I end up with sine times sine is sine squared over sine plus, this just stays the same. But now that we have a common denominator, I can put the tops together. So I can put this whole numerator together here. This becomes sine squared plus cosine squared. That sounds familiar. Sine squared plus cosine squared is equal to 1. This is equal to 1 over sine. And 1 over sine is equal to cosecant. And again, it's like, I don't think I'm going to get much more compact than that. So we're just trying to make these look as simple as possible. So same tips. So I look at this, sine, cosine. You know, while we're doing some of these in the notes, maybe once you see the problem, maybe you want to stop the video and just write down the problem and try it yourself and then see if you can do it, and then maybe watch and see how I finish it. And remember, there's not just one way to do these. That's kind of an important thing to remember. There's more than one correct way, as long as you're doing things that are mathematically correct. Like when we're adding fractions, that you're finding a common denominator. You're not just putting the two together without following the rules for doing that. So different ways to do it. You just have to make sure you're following mathematical rules. Okay, so I'm going to look at this here. This is cos times cos, which is cos squared. Now over sine. I think I'm just going to keep this sine over 1. And once again, it looks like I've got two fractions, so I'm going to try to make that 1 by multiplying this by sine and this by sine. So now I've got cosine squared over sine plus sine squared over sine. This is looking awfully familiar. This is not the same problem that we had earlier, but it's looking very similar because, you know, once again, I see, oh, cosine squared plus sine squared. It doesn't matter that cosine squared is first. You know, cos plus sin is the same as sin plus cos. And we know that is equivalent to a 1. And then we can put that over the common denominator of sine. And just like before, 1 over sin. So these were different problems. This one, and I'm talking about this one from before. By the way, one had that theta symbol. This one has x, doesn't matter. X, theta, they're both variables. But they were different problems, but we ended up with kind of similar endings. Just coincidentally, similar endings. Okay. Next one, I look at that and gosh, it's tempting to distribute. And so we don't, you know, we want to follow our temptations, right? And distribute. And cos times cos is cos squared. I can see the middle two terms are going to cross off. Negative cos plus cos. And this is 1 minus cosine squared. Okay, well, I can probably put these two together, but I'm looking at that and I see a 1 and a cosine squared. So I'm going to kind of go back to my identities. And that looks like I might be able to use this here in some fashion. I can either substitute the 1. So maybe we should try that. Let's substitute the 1 for sine squared plus cosine squared. The other thing I could do is I could minus cosine squared first, but let's just do it like this. I think it's a little easier to see. So we're going to substitute 1 with sine squared plus cosine squared and see if that helps. So, whoa. So we're substituting 1 with sine squared plus cosine squared. We're just substituting that 1 for that because 1 equals that. Well, now I see that cosine squared minus sine squared, that's just going to cancel out, right? These will just cancel out. It's just like 2 minus 2 is 0. Those are going to cancel out also. And we are left with sine squared. So I don't think we're going to get any more compact than that. We're just going to do 2 more, okay? So we'll do 2 more. This one, cosecant, I know cosecant is the same as 1 over sine. And cotangent is the same as cosine over sine. And when I look at this, it's like, oh, I've got a fraction within a fraction. Whenever I have that, I'm going to divide by the second fraction. And remember, dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So the reciprocal is sine over cos. Now look at that. Hey, we can cross this and this off. And we are left with 1 over cos. And 1 over cos is secant. All right, one last one. So cotangent is cos over sin. Sin is just sin. I'm going to put it over 1 just so we can see a little bit better what goes on top, what goes on the bottom. Secant is 1 over sine. And cosine is just cosine. All right, and it's like, oh, what a mess there. I do see on the top that this is going to cross off. So we end up with cos on top. And on the bottom, we end up with cos over sin. So again, we're dividing by a fraction. So I think I'm going to take that cos and I'm going to multiply it by the reciprocal. Sine over cos. And now things are looking pretty good because I can see that cos over cos is going to cross off. We end up with sine over 1, which is just sine. All right. So I did those honestly fairly smoothly, but that's probably not the way it's going to be for you. So just expect that this is going to be a little trial and error. You're going to try some of these tips here that we're talking about here at the beginning. But sometimes they're not always going to work. But sometimes you go one direction and that works, and you go another direction, that always works. As long as you're following some of these mathematical recommendations here, and in this case, you make it as simple as possible. You get to the most simple end possible. All right, good luck.